Hello, welcome back to Parley, the show where you folks support the other stuff I make by paying me monthly to talk about the topic of your choice. And this month, Densoro has requested some discussion about different DMing arrangements for Dungeons and Dragons or any other tabletop role-playing game you might be playing. I'm aware that you might say Game Master for a game that isn't Dungeons and Dragons Dungeon Master, but Densoro and I are just going to say DM for this video. It's what we're used to. It's the same thing. Densoro says, I'm curious if you've experimented with different DMing arrangements in your D&D games. I'm always on the hunt for a tabletop role-playing game that can keep dice fuckery, that could mean a lot of things, to a minimum, and I've bumped into a handful of intriguing examples. As a kind of ground rule for this parlay, I just want you to keep in mind that people's needs are very different. You know, you could mean a lot of things by dice fuckery there. You could mean that you do not desire the randomness of a 20-sided die. You might mean that you don't want the DM to be able to fudge dice rolls. You could mean a lot of things, and at least those problems, at least the ones I can think of, I don't have. So I wouldn't be interested in these things for maybe the same reason. They would need to be purpose-built. The only thing I want to say before we start is that I think if you're going to change or pick a set of rules, which not everyone is doing when they play these games, but if you are, just think about what problems maybe they solve, what problems you have, other ways you could solve those problems, to make sure that you're not building something deliberately that doesn't actually fit your goals or needs. Because I think that is common in these types of games. I think it's frequently done that people misplace a lot of effort into investing into a system that isn't trying to do what they want to do well. Now, that's perfectly okay. It's important to keep in mind, indeed, that most people don't play a game or a video game, but any game, use a system for what it's good at. That has never been a part of the discussion for them. They play Dungeons and Dragons because it is popular. They may overlap with Dungeons and Dragons strengths. That may be why it's popular, but that's not why they sought it out. They sought it out because their friends were playing it or because it was available at their local game store. Not because out of the options, which they can't possibly know all of anyway, it happens to fulfill their goals the best. That is arguably not even possible. So again, it might sound like, are those people just using it wrong? But it's not even really possible to look at all the options. All I'm trying to say is that when you do change the rules of something, yeah, that's a time where you definitely should, put in a rule for a purpose, for what you think it'd be good at. So I'm going to try to talk about these different options based on what I think would be their pros and cons, their benefits and detriments, so that if I or you or we were to use them, we would hopefully be using them, for a good purpose, to solve a problem. And indeed, I'm very tempted to launch into a whole rant about how maybe for some people this entire type of game isn't a good fit, but we just don't have time, so let's get started. First of all, Densoro says the card and improv game Archipelago lets everyone at the table roll a character and simultaneously appoint themselves the DM of one aspect of the setting. You might have a DM of geography, a DM of lore, a DM of wildlife, etc. The world can be divided into any domains the players imagine. Cool. So the DMing role is divided. Now, I very much want players to try these games, despite my belief that they're more popular than it's warranted that they be, and not everybody would enjoy playing a role-playing game. It's just a thing that's become popular because I'm trying to keep myself from going on this rant, okay? But I do want everyone to try them. So I'm just going to briefly give an example of what a role-playing game laid out the way D&D suggests by default would be, and then we're going to do this to it. We're going to modify it. Maybe I'm the dungeon master and I've got my druid and my rogue, and we're rolling into town, and the druid has this rainbow bark that they've always used as a spellcasting component, and they want to learn more about it in this town. This is an unknown town that wasn't marked on a map. Nobody where they came from knew about this bark. Maybe people will here. So they look around and they say, yeah, I want to see if there's maybe like a local botanist or herbalist, maybe a florist. And is there anyone talking about, maybe I hear a rumor about the rainbow bark or something. And I, as the dungeon master for this game, would say, okay, now I have to make that happen in the game. Roll a perception check, I would say to my druid. My druid is going to roll a d20, a 20-sided die. They roll a 13, and they also add their perception bonus. D&D perception is a wisdom skill, so they add their wisdom stat. Druids spellcast with wisdom with their learned experience of the world. So my druid's wisdom is pretty high. And they could also have proficiency in perception. So they add their bonus that scales with level to perception because they've decided their character is particularly good at a few things, one of which is perception. And so they add +8 and they get a 21. Pretty good. So I, the DM, say, all right, well, I'll go from what I already knew or thought about this setting, maybe modify those things. And perhaps the fact that they rolled high or low or asked a certain way will inspire me to make things be different. So I might say, all right, yeah, I mean, of course there's a local herbalist, and they're in the center of town. If they rolled a 21, they easily find that person. So I'll tell them about the local herbalist. And they're going to be whatever. They'll be an elderly elf woman with a deep love of daikon radishes or something. Sure. But they rolled a 21. Maybe their nose, maybe they smell something. Bark? It's bark. What if there's like a potion shop and they're making root beer syrup or something? That could be fun. And my rogue did nick that potion off some rich adventurer earlier. Maybe I should do that. They might not go if I say there's a potion shop, but I'll say they smell some kind of rooty, sweet, caramelized thing. And they see a local herbalist, but next to it they also see a potion shop. And there are a lot of people around. They could ask for rumors. I'll improv that if they go with that option. Okay, I'll tell them to do those things. And in that moment, I'll describe that stuff. They'll choose to go wherever they go. So you can see that by default, the DM and the player have this kind of back and forth relationship. This first suggestion that Densoro suggests, Archipelago, is having basically each player be part of the DM, I would say. Does something a little different to that. In our example from before, perhaps I am the DM of the environment or the towns or the geography, you could say. And so I still give them that perception result for them searching the area. But when we go into the potion shop and our rogue indeed tries to sell that potion they stole, my druid is the person in charge of magic items, where normally I, if I was the sole DM, would have known what that did. When I said, oh, our rogue stole that potion, maybe I'll say there's a potion shop, and I decided that about the story. In this model, I didn't know what the potion actually did. And so when our rogue says, all right, while they're browsing, I try to sell the potion. And our druid, who happens to be the person in charge of magic items and the mechanics, says, all right, yeah, I know what the potion is. So you can roll an Arcana check to try to find out yourself. You could try to just sell it right away with a persuasion or deception check, etc. And maybe I'm playing a barbarian, and while in the shop, I see a rage potion that can extend and enhance the powers of my rage, a tonic of fortitude or some such. And I ask the clerk about it, and so the druid says, yeah, okay, like, you look how as you ask this? Like, you look like a giant muscly dude that's an easy mark for selling this potion. Roll a performance check. Like, do you look like a sap right now? And I would roll that way. Maybe I didn't know the clerk was that kind of person, but my druid, in this moment, that player, decided as the DM of this shop that the clerk is trying to fleece me or whatever. I like the idea. Strength of this model to me seems to be that it lets the players play off of each other in a new way. It seems like we're collaborating a little more. My druid wasn't planning to have this potion shop here, but when I was acting as the DM of this environment, I made there be a potion shop in response to my DM, my druid player's character rolling. We went there, and then my druid player, as the DM of the magic items, then had an opportunity to manipulate this situation with a potion seller. That seems like a major advantage. That's cool. It puts less individual creative burden on each person. It encourages you to just do fun things, and then somebody will pick it up some way. I think in the best case, exactly what everyone was in charge of might even blur a little bit. Like, people would be willing to just improv it up. That could be great. And in a group that is maybe less okay with or comfortable with each other, this also gives people strict guidelines. You as the DM are not doing anything other than choosing what animals are in the environment or something. That sounds stringent for some groups, but it also might be a really good point of guidance for some groups. Some groups might really enjoy the fact that they feel like they have their role and this is their time to do the thing. Other groups might enjoy making this into a sort of open court improv where everybody makes the story, even from the perspective of constructing the game, not just with individual characters. A bad thing, though, is that I think there is a lot of metagaming concerns. Not necessarily people acting in bad faith, but for example, like my druid in the example I gave before, well, they know what the potion my rogue has does, but it's meant to be a secret. The druid doesn't know, but the player playing the druid does know, because they're also the DM of the magic items. Normally, all these things that are meant to be surprises or secrets are concentrated on one person who also isn't playing a character. So there's no need for them to play pretend with their life that they don't know. It's quite possible that the player playing the druid is going to have to pretend they don't know that the potion is a potion of healing and literally die rather than break the immersion of the story, which, like, that could be really fun for some groups, but it could also be very frustrating for other groups. And really what will happen almost always is that it will just be very difficult to be impartial. Like, that's just hard. How much you think that's a problem or not, I actually think that sounds pretty fun. That happens in my game sometimes, in an example I'll talk about in a minute. But that's definitely a challenge. And so you're not consolidating the things that are meant to be secret on one person whose life of their character isn't at stake with those secrets, right? This wouldn't always happen, of course, and you don't need to have loads of secrets in your campaign. Maybe it isn't known what the potion does. Even the druid, as the player, as the DM of magic items, they don't determine what the potion does, just that it is a powerful potion of something. Maybe they don't even know if it's positive or negative. And they simply wait, so they don't have to pretend they don't know what it does. They literally don't know what it does, and they kind of decide on the spot or something. I know as a DM I've done this before, even though I didn't even need to. It just seemed interesting. I didn't have no idea what things it could do. I didn't decide it specifically on the spot, but I let it be a bit more random. I didn't lock in what it was going to be. I made sure it was something that would be interesting to the players and picked from a limited list instead. So, of course, there are other ways you could do it. Right, you could avoid that metagaming concern if it was a big problem for your group, and it might be a positive for some groups. There might be a fun acting exercise for some groups. Yeah, I also think another concern, pretty major one for my play group, would be this splitting up of the DMing responsibility. Well, it depends on having players that want to create a world. There's a certain level of measured arrogance to wanting people to listen to your creation instead of someone else's. Now, some of you might be thinking, what are you talking about? My entire group wants everything to be about their backstory. They would be all over this. Yeah, okay, but there are definitely groups, like mine, where the other players, it's the opposite. If anything, I have trouble getting them, as the DM of my own game, to provide any authorship at all toward the story, to put anything into the world, to decide things about the world. They just don't want to. They don't come up with that stuff naturally. That's perfectly fine. But in my group, we're hard-pressed to have one DM. It also takes more time. You know, you'd have to have people who are all willing to do a bit of prep most sessions. And encounter design might be a bit different. Again, I haven't played this specific game, but if you were to play it as a tabletop role-playing game campaign, like D&D, but you're just splitting up the responsibility, that might feel a bit different. Again, not necessarily bad. Maybe you have an even mix of people with free time, or maybe you have one person with way more free time or mental energy and things they want to put into a world, or they just want to play off other players. Another thing this might be good at, though, quickly, is to counter DMs that want too much authorship, which I think is most of them. A lot of people who DM, well, they want to DM because they want to tell their story. And I think that the best DMs are people who have just enough of the self-centered arrogance to tell a story, but no more. They don't actually want to tell their specific story. That is not fun to them. They want to tell the player's story well. And so they do want to be the one telling the story, but with as little of their own creative direction as possible. They want to be a producer or a publisher or a director but they don't want to write the script, something like that, if that makes sense. They're framing scenes, they're improving ideas that come in, but not really coming up with or changing them except when they're required to. They try to leave that as much as possible to the players. I think that is the platonic ideal DM that nobody is, right? And a good way to counter a DM that wants way too much authorship and is just reading their novel to the players might be to divide them up, to break them into shards. That could be cool. So yeah, I think there could be lots of benefits to this method. Again, my experience, which has been quite negative, I'll share with you, with playing D&D with most playgroups has been, it seems to me like a lot of people would like that, but my playgroup currently wouldn't. And personally, I'm not sure I would like it. I don't know. I really like having all the control over that role, but then giving it up. I'm not sure I want to share it as per se. It's not that I want all of it. It's that I like the idea that you kind of have a methodology that stays consistent. It also means that you can instigate systems and plant seeds that you aren't sure you'll be able to follow up on. For example, in my current campaign, we've got this new party member. The players have recruited someone, and she is a lycanthrope, I've determined. And so during a fight, she pops out claws and attacks with them. Very minor detail at the moment, but eventually they will find out that she's a lycanthrope, for better or for worse. Exactly the consequence of this, I don't know. Maybe it won't be fun for them if there's a bloodthirsty werewolf in their midst, so I will make that not be the way. Maybe she's a very controlled lycanthrope. Maybe they'll need a power-up in combat, and it will make sense to have her be very in control of her lycanthropy. I don't know yet. We're going to have to see how it plays out and what they seem interested in. You see how I've come up with an idea that I think could be fun as a knobbed turn, but I don't know or care or want to know exactly how it's going to play out. But if I didn't have control as the single DM of the game, I wouldn't be able to follow up on that because the other people wouldn't know what I was doing. And then on the flip side, a lot of the time these threads get lost. When I had this character pop out their claws, it's possible my players just didn't remember that. And if we were playing off of each other, it might be more likely that someone would pick it up on the spot and like make something happen with that. If DMing a game means you get one session a week to kind of tell a story, your players might just not remember these things unless it's a group world building experience. So I'm not sure whether that's a benefit or a detriment. It depends on the playgroup is what I'm trying to say. But I do think it's interesting how having sole control of that lets you follow up in a way, but it also might make it harder for people to remember, making it meaningless to follow up. Anyhow, we'll keep going. Kind of related to that same idea of sharing the DMing thing. Densoro says, do you have an opinion on DMPCs, Dungeon Master player characters? I am the sole DM in our example from before, but my druid, my rogue, and my barbarian is still in the game, but I am the sole DM in charge of the stuff. This has many of the same potential problems as before, where I might have a lot of metagaming pressure on me to not say, I know that rogue's potion can save our lives, but my barbarian who's about to die doesn't know that, so I have to just die even though I know we could be saved. Or I'm pressured to do something that's kind of riding the line. I say, oh, I'm going to die anyway, so I might as well drink this, when I, the player, actually do know it will save me, and I can't delete that information from my mind, right? Okay. Densoro says, I found a lot of resentment for the concept in the general tabletop RPG community, and I've played with a particularly overbearing specimen once before. Indeed, I think it's pretty obvious why having a DM PC is a bad idea for most people. It's bad advice, because most people want to win. They want too much authorship. They have too much of that, the special sauce arrogance that I was suggesting before. They want to win. They want to write. They want to be the person doing the story. And that can be good if it's properly reined in, but it usually isn't. I think it's better if people just want less of that and they want to tell a story with other people. If you give them a player character, they will misuse that power. And it's not because they're an immature little rascal, it's because it's hard not to. However, this platonic ideal DM I suggested, who doesn't exist, should have no problem with this. Like, on paper, there's really no issue, because I believe the best DM would genuinely not want to give their player an unfair advantage. They don't want to give the barbarian, I in this example, don't want to give my barbarian an unfair advantage. I want things to be, if anything, harder. It's a cruel irony that I enjoy like a fine wine, that I die knowing the rogue had a potion that would full heal me that I have to pretend I don't know exists. The ideal DM, in my mind, is someone who wants that to happen, who almost wants to be worse off because they have to avoid metagaming, because it makes for interesting storytelling or irony or something. That. I just think nobody actually is that way, right? And so in practice, you shouldn't have DMPCs, but for the right person, and if we say, oh, you know who you are, then people who are actually not a good person to do this will do it. So we can't say anybody should do it. But obviously there are situations where, in theory, you could be a person where you'd run a DMPC and it would be great, like good even, actively good, potentially. It's pretty obvious what the problems would be. It's bad advice, I think. But could it theoretically be good? Yeah, I think there are a lot of advantages. You could play a type of character that would support the other players in pretty elaborate ways. Being a supportive character can be a little dry if you're the player, and your only way to influence the world is by your own actions. But it could be really fun as a DM if you get to use that as a mechanical way to support your players' efforts on the ground while you construct a challenge around them. To put it another way, when you as the DM give your player an advantage that feels like the world bending to their will, it feels very unfair in a way that when you give them a disadvantage that feels like the world reacting to them doesn't. It feels natural. The world is hard. When the seas part for your players, it feels like you're being too easy on them as the DM, and that feels unfun sometimes. When the seas are choppy and your players are trying to sail across, it feels like just the world being the way the world is. Now, you can modulate the exact difficulty your characters are having if you, the DM, have a player character that positively supports them, but only using game mechanics. I'm thinking of like a bard. I'll tell you that in my own campaign, I've actually done this and really enjoyed it. I have a barbarian that is the shipwright of the ship that my players are sailing the ocean with. This is a bard and barbarian subclass character. The party demonstrated that they were pretty shy. They're worried about getting aped by some big melee monster, and they pretty clearly expressed that they want a tank and they want support. So I made a derpy character that doesn't have much mechanical finesse, that just rages, does a good amount of damage, has a ton of hit points, and can inspire. They can give them an additional die to roll when they do their things. That's pretty much all this character does. They're very fun to play for me. They're not complicated to play. They hardly have anything they can do. They're powerful, so it's satisfying to play them because they have impact, but they only ever really accomplish anything in tandem with my other players. For example, barbarians are really good at grappling, so you can hold someone still in a neck hold while your party attacks them. That can be very effective. And again, it feels much more fair because you, the DM, are helping your players in a way strictly locked into game mechanics. I give you an additional die to roll using the Bard's inspiration feature only once per turn using my bonus action, not in some other setting-based way, right? That feels much more fair and like they know the level of assistance they can expect, right? Whereas when I make the fight harder behind the scenes, they not only don't see that because I'm adjusting the monster's HP behind the scenes depending on how much damage they're doing, it's also like the game getting tougher, which feels more fair, like a challenge they can overcome. I give the enemy more health, they feel more cool when they did 100 damage in 2 rounds at level 6 and, topple this big enemy. I don't know, those are just random numbers. Does that make sense? So I do think the idea of DMPCs has a lot of clear major benefits. I think the big problem with DMPCs is that for all that you can argue about, yeah, like it's bad advice in general, I think obviously. And yeah, of course it's possible to do it well. Yeah, but like what's the benefit? Like, but what would be the good thing about doing it? Kind of like I said at the top of the video, I think it's important to come back to okay, yeah, this could be a non-negative, or it could mitigate a negative, but is it actually positive? Like, should you do it if you're the person for whom, and you're not, we have to say you're not, even though I guess you technically might be, but you aren't. You're not. Don't do it. Don't have a DMPC. But someone is, and someone is doing it effectively. But like, is it better than if they didn't? And I think potentially yes, actually. If you could cultivate the skill of doing this well. Personally, I would suggest a supportive character. I hope that makes sense why there could be lots of other examples. Again, it could just be fulfilling utility the party doesn't have with like a human that constantly operates that character that knows them very well. It could just be fun to combo with your friends. Again, there's a lot of ways to do it where you get to play as the DM. You really do get to play and do badass things, but it is still focused on your players. You're just enabling them, but in a way where you really do get to participate. I would be interested to run builds I want to try on characters that will be relatively disposable using this method, as someone who has way too many character builds and isn't even a player in any game at the moment. I will never ever get to play all of these character builds, so it would be cool to have a way to do that. Some of them are just not going to be well suited, right? Don't play like a burst damage spellcaster who one-shots everything themselves as the DM like that. First of all, that just won't be fun. But anyway, or it would be pointless because you would not one-shot something because you, the DM, increased the enemy's HP, which means your character literally just did nothing. Like, what? Anyway, it doesn't make any sense to do that, in my opinion. Maybe there's a way that's cool. I think maybe no. One last thing about DMPCs. You could build a very linear character and have that be interesting. So what I mean is maybe the character is mechanically complicated, but like that doesn't matter though. Your players know they have very high single target damage. They get in there against those humanoids and go quicken spell, mind sliver, heightened spell, hold person, silvery barbs, and immobilize the target, and then fire the eldritch blast, upcasted scorching ray, 7 crits, they take 300 damage and die in a horrible burst of sulfurous flames. But like that was just one guy over there, and your party members directed your player character as like part of the squad or party or whatever, like go handle that guy, and then you, the DMPC, you get to pop off with your magic combo while they don't have to deal with all the complicated crap that goes into whatever monstrosity of a multi-class build I just made. It's a sorcerer warlock, I guess. And the outcome is very simple. You see what I mean? Like you are doing a bit of burst damage, but you're applying it. The result is very simple. The process is complicated, but you, the DM, you just handle that. You don't even really have to worry about it too much because you're the one running the rules. You just say they do their burst damage thing, which they can do about 3 times a day, and that enemy dies in 2 rounds. And I can think of that out as the DM. They're fighting over here. If your party members enjoy directing people that way, it could be really fun for them to have an ally that does has a known capability like that. You know what I mean? Again, I think this could very quickly become pointless. If you do burst damage to a boss, you, the DM, end up in a situation where you either one-shotted your own boss and removed an encounter from your players, which is pointless, or you don't do that, which means you increase the boss's health, which means your character effectively did no damage, which means it was pointless. So anyway, just keep that in mind. Right now, my player characters have a whole crew of NPCs with them, and one way I've been dealing with this issue is by telling them, you know, they have other things they want to do. Like it's a whole crew of pirates. They have their own agenda. You're not the commandant, deciding who's gonna go where. They have their own agendas. So if you want to try to convince someone to come with you, they can. And occasionally all of you might fight together, like if the ship gets attacked, and that's cool. But usually the whole party isn't actually together, and they just kind of have to sweet talk members of their crew to go get in some dangerous shenanigans with them, which lets me, the DM, really control just how much assistance they have, and subtly bias them from having like damage focused characters on the squad. There's a warlock on their crew that is a bit damage focused, like I described. I can make them not interested if the situation arises. So they get to ask for help if they want, but I, as the DM, have a little control over who is helping, which can be fun because it's a different kind of encounter design. And it also lets me operate a player character without at all overwhelming the game situation. But I would say that's a little different than having a dedicated DM PC. So anyway, I hope that's interesting. Okay, going on to the last few examples. In that vein, Densoro says, I've been considering assigning a squad leader for each mission in Nova, another tabletop RPG, a player who sets the scene as DM by framing it as one member of the party briefing the rest of the squad. I think this mirrors the role of mission host in Warframe quite satisfyingly. Maybe. I think this is a really good idea. So the idea would be, maybe in the situation I described in the party I'm in, yeah, they might bring along the barbarian that I described from before, but my druid and my rogue are still the primary members of the party. So one or the other of them will set the scene, maybe at the beginning of a fight, or as we're going into town. I can say, tell me what you see, and they get a little bit of authorship where they get to say, okay, well, within reason, I find the town herbalist because they would all have one because people get infected sometimes. This town has a healthy population, so they have an herbalist. I find that herbalist. There's really no need for them to roll just to find the herbalist the town of course has that would be readily available if you asked anyone. So it's okay if they say, like, I find the town herbalist and he's looking a little sketchy to me. Maybe he's been taking a few too many, if you know what I'm saying. Not feeling so good about this. Hopefully the other members of my party can keep the situation on track. Or maybe my rogue would say, all right, we're sizing up the enemy we're going to ambush behind this tree. Looks to be, 4 feet tall or so, hunched back, big cloak. Hard to see specific features or make out what race this creature is, but their pockets are heavily laden with coins. Now, maybe I later, the DM of the overall game, might decide their pockets were actually heavily laden with something else or whatever. We don't have to do everything exactly the way this player says. But what I love about this idea, I'm definitely going to do this in my own game. This is a great suggestion for my game anyway, is that the reason I'm going to use it is because it encourages players that are having some shyness or difficulty role-playing to set the scene in a way that is to their advantage or fun, I guess. A really common piece of role-playing advice for Dungeons & Dragons, for DMs, is to ask your players questions about how they do combat actions. The idea here is quite simple. This is something the player is deciding they do already. They're anchored by the mechanics. It's in a part of the game that is very structured. So you're giving them a gentle nudge. The ability, the attack with a weapon or the spell, already provides a lot of prompts for exactly what happens, at least in Dungeons & Dragons, something I think is a big strength of that system. Very open-ended or rules-light tabletop RPGs really have a weakness here. They're good for players that don't need help with this stuff, but you can just ignore these things in D&D if you don't need them. If a spell says you hold up a holy symbol to cast it, and your party is very improv happy and they're willing to come up with something on their own, and the holy symbol doesn't have like a material cost or anything, it doesn't really matter what they do to cast the spell. But if they're a player that doesn't have any picture in their head of what happens when they cast, the idea that they hold up their holy symbol to cast is a good place to start. Like, that's helpful. Again, it depends completely on the group. My group, we need this. This is extremely helpful. The idea that when spells have a verbal component, that's a good time to say, all right, this spell literally only has a verbal component. You just shout a word and it happens. What do you shout? And my player has a chance to respond. From a game perspective, it's very structured. All they have to do is come up with one thing they would say. They can phone it in. They don't have to voice act. They can say, I don't know, what would a cleric say in this situation? And I'd say, I don't know, maybe some holy word like, let there be light, and then the light spell happens, or whatever. But it encourages them to dip their foot in the pond. Now, I'm not going to go on about this too much in this parlay, but I do want to briefly come back to something I said at the top. Keep in mind that if your players struggle with this point enough, maybe a game like D&D isn't the best fit. A lot of the game is allowing that in to what is otherwise a rules system for combat. maybe you should play a game more focused on the rules system if your players just don't want to put role-playing in there, right? You need to take a while to determine whether they're simply shy and getting used to it, and they want to, but it's just not something they're, comfortable with yet or whatever. Sure. At the same time, I think a lot of groups try this forever, and the truth is their group just doesn't want that out of a game. So please just keep that in mind. I would hate for someone to have less fun than they could because they kind of forced that for a long time. Anyway, I think that this idea of one player being the kind of squad leader and setting the scene for an encounter is a really cool extension of this idea about like role-playing your attacks in combat. Again, which it doesn't work for everyone, but I do think that's good advice. It's popular advice for a reason. Because it gives a little bit more of a framing. You, the DM, are saying, okay, here's what the environment looks like. You're lining up this attack. What's happening? My rogue, what are you hiding? But are you all hiding behind something? Or, set the scene for the other members of the team. I'm not giving every possible example, but I think this is a really good idea. I think it might be useful for my group specifically. So thank you for suggesting it. Finally, Densoro says to leave in a chonky note, Gone to Hell by Penguin King Games uses a baffling system where there's one player and a whole table full of DMs. Each DM controls one enemy faction, Grenier Corpus Infested, factions in any game, sure. However, the DMs only set the initial scene. Beyond that, they can only take reactions every time the player takes an action. I feel like this sort of relative reactivity captures the player-driven spirit of a video game, where the player decides which door to kick down, and the game is obliged to load around them, which, to be blunt, is already what I think ideal DMing looks like. But of course, that's only my idea of ideal DMing. In my example at the beginning of this parlay, I described how my druid saying, "What do you see in town?" or "What do I see in town?" is making me, the single DM, react and decide what they see in town. I might have come up with a few ideas beforehand, but I think at best, you, the DM, will add some new things based on the circumstances or modify things that you added. Again, my very subjective personal opinion is that the best DM for a solo DM is somebody who wants to decide but doesn't want a specific decision, which I think hardly anyone does. No one is that person, maybe, but in theory that's really good. In practice, maybe it would be better to have a system where that is literally the only way you're allowed to do the thing. Maybe forcing the DMs to be on the back foot is interesting, and having the player kind of David and Goliath against a bunch of DMs by being the only one able to actually initiate a reaction, kind of like wishing to a genie who then gets a lot of unilateral power to interpret your wish. Would be a fun way to play. That's very interesting. I'm going to read a little more. With each chapter completed in Gone to Hell, this game with all DMs and one player, the baton of player is passed to the next participant each chapter around, and the prior player steps back into the role of a faction DM. Yeah, I think the idea that it lets everybody do the job is also a really interesting thing to mix and match with many of these other things. In the whole squad leader setting the scene temporary DM thing, obviously that should rotate. Having different players be the DM from time to time is interesting. I think for the right group, the idea that there's one DM, but that person simply rotates from time to time, every arc, every region, whatever, could be a way to keep things fresh. I'm aware that's actually a not unpopular way to do things. While almost everyone is playing with one DM and a bunch of players, it's not like nobody is rotating who's the DM for a campaign. Maybe not for like a book campaign. For a type of campaign where you're coming up with the stuff, it could be cool because it's not like there's any source of the spoilers anyway, except the previous DM's computer, which they can just hide or whatever. So the idea of rotating any of these systems is good, in my opinion. But in particular, this one where one person just gets to be the player and it rotates like that is cool. This reminds me a lot of how a lot of groups, I enjoy this a lot in Critical Role, a lot of groups rotate who's the DM, but one person is the DM much more of the time. They do this by having other players run one-shots. So for example, in Critical Role, Matt Mercer is usually the DM, but Taliesin Jaffe, Taliesin Jaffe, has a one shot, or maybe a few, that I personally really enjoyed. It was quite interesting to see those different DMing styles with at least some similar players, like mutual players. I think you can see in Taliesin's gameplay style in Critical Role that he would be the kind of DM he is when he DMs himself. And that is fascinating. I have a player, my rogue, in these examples I've been giving you. They're not really playing a rogue. I've oversimplified their kind of weird build. They're a ranger cleric multiclass, a trickery cleric, if you must know. Gloomstalker ranger. But basically a rogue with like magic and stuff. They, I think, would make a very interesting DM of a different kind than me. They would not be using my approach. I think that would be really cool. And we are going to try in the next few months having them run a one-shot. I'm keen to play because I haven't been a player for a long time, but it's also going to be really interesting to see what style they have. In particular, I think the idea of rotating the DM, or in Gone to Hell, this game's case, rotating who is the only player, could be an interesting way to kind of change genre when playing a campaign. If you wanted to create something spoopy or actiony or silly, you can easily imagine friends in your life, I hope. Well, anyway, I don't know your life, okay? I don't know about you. I don't know if I have friends. People in the group of people you might play with for whom making them drive in some way, them being the sole DM, them being the sole player, would make the game have a certain tone. And personally, my recommendation would be to embrace that if you think this would be a good fit for your group. That seems like one of the strengths of this system. It might even be interesting to plan out ahead of time, like an itinerary for how it's going to rotate, such that there are story beats planned where like there's a bit of comical levity as a player who is going to be very silly steps into the role of being the only one allowed to initiate actions, or when the game is going to be more lighthearted and everyone's a little busy, a DM who is not going to plan as many long story plots is the DM for a few months, because you're not losing anything by them not planning out story beats that you would forget anyway in the time you have to be away. Stuff like that. Those are just very simple examples. Obviously, you could get more complicated. I know very little about horror. My druid player might run a more exciting spoopy themed segment, and it is that time of the year at the time I'm recording. So that all sounds really interesting. That sounds like a lot of potential there. Again, in theory, I'm tempted to say it says, I don't know your life, Densoro, but it says a lot for you to say that the defining thing about this Gone to Hell game is that the DMs only take reactions every time the player takes an action. That's already how I DM. Like, I in my mind, like I read that and thought that's just what DMing is. Well, yeah, no, I'm sure plenty of people don't do that. Wow, yeah, biases, right? Anyway, I thought that was very interesting. Again, this can be challenging to discuss because for a lot of people, some of these changes speak right past the game experience they've been having. In their game, one or another thing I've mentioned literally just doesn't happen. Or there will be people listening to this video who are saying Dungeons and Dragons is a math game, which, like, from my perspective, looking at the game design, it just really isn't, though. There is a lot of math built into it that is very valuable, but I don't feel it is very tenable to argue that the game is primarily defined by the fact that there's the math. Like, if anything, rolling a d20 and letting the systems have the flexibility and the unclear wording to allow for role-playing kind of flies in the face of the idea that the game is focused on its math. The math is there as a backbone. The game does a lot of things that objectively make it not too focused on that. You can play it focused on those things, but I don't see how you could argue that. But people would, right? Who cares what I think? People would certainly argue, people do argue that, and it doesn't make any sense to me, but I am only one person playing one way. Yes, if you hold me at gunpoint, do I suggest maybe considering whether this game is a perfect fit if that's what you're trying to do? Yeah. But it probably isn't better to go back in time and change the game you learned to something else, because you can't do that, instead of playing D&D, you know? The only thing I think is important is to think about why you are playing it. If you were going to play Dungeons and Dragons in this way that I'm talking a bunch of crap about. It's fine, have fun. Focused on its mathematics, on crunching numbers. If you were gonna do that, I think you'd be a lot better off thinking about how, yeah, a lot of the mechanics in D&D just literally aren't that. Like, they objectively are not focused on that. Maybe change the rolling system you're using to something more focused on making the numbers be the focus rather than a bunch of variants. Maybe roll 3d8, 3d6, like we talked about in the tabletop RPG rolling parlay, group parlay we did. Things like that, little tweaks like that. It would be better to acknowledge that that isn't something some of the game systems are trying to do, so you can remove them and put in something you'd enjoy more, right? There's no moral high ground for system purity here, right? As long as you and your group understand, then it's fine. But of course, a lot of groups don't mutually understand, which is why people feel it's important to follow the official rules, which don't exist. Like, much of the time people look to, for example, Jeremy Crawford, who's on Twitter and will sometimes say, I would rule it this way or whatever. And he's said in many interviews that he doesn't think of it as being that that is the correct ruling. There is no correct ruling, says the person who designed the game. So by the book, like, there isn't a single answer. But of course, the type of people going back to the text, well, they want a single answer. There's utility to having a single answer. I do think there are places where D&D's rules could be better about this. One that I always like to bring up is how, for druids, it says druids will not wear metal armor. Now, you could interpret that a lot of ways. It could be a world building thing, suggestion, mandatory stipulation if you don't know how words work, that druids won't wear metal armor. Does this mean, from a game design perspective, that the developers are telling you that druids have to have worse armor class because they can't wear anything other than hide? Well, I'm not saying yes or no. You decide for yourself. But we will agree that the game does not make it clear what it means by that. Putting in parentheses, in a way no other part of the game ever does, druids will not wear metal armor, doesn't perfectly accurately convey anything. Maybe you can just get something equivalent to those other forms of armor using things that are not metal. Maybe. Maybe you have a tribe that makes scale mail out of hardened bone or something. That it's a fantasy world. I don't think that's that weird. And then this has no mechanical consequences. It's just a flavor point. Maybe it does have mechanical consequences. I've read some websites that will remain nameless that act as if it should be assumed that druids always have bad AC because it says they can't wear metal armor, which, like, that's a reasonable interpretation, but a huge assumption about what that means. And if we were going to use Dungeons and Dragons as a kind of basic set of rules we can all understand, wouldn't it be better if the game just kind of clarified what it means by that? We can still just ignore it if we disagree. I do ignore it. I think that's a messy, irresponsible way to write that. That's not very helpful. Forget it. Also, what counts as a piece of metal, by the way? If I wear studded leather, are the studs too much metal? Are they even made of metal on my studded leather? Again, is my scale mail, is my ring mail made of metal? You could conceivably make it of something else. If my quarterstaff has metal inlays, do I have to remove them to use it? I don't think so. Can I cast Shillelagh on a club that has a metal handle? I don't think so, but I don't know. Like, it doesn't really make that clear, right? Like, what is a club for the purpose of that discussion? Is those spiked maces, is that not a club? That's solid metal, usually. Is that a club or not? Can I cast Shillelagh on that? Doesn't seem consistent to me, because it isn't. And this is all fine. It's just to say, if I were to offer some critique, it's important to keep in mind that for some types of players, it's helpful to have a mutual body of rules so that the DM, so that the players have some guidance to not act in bad faith, to have a sort of mutual tennis court, a net up with which they can play. That's not useful to me and my play group because we've known each other for 15 years and we understand that we're acting in good faith, but it's not valueless. And I'd argue it's more helpful to have it there and then just ignore it if you don't want it, which I haven't yet played a game that does a good job of. I think D&D does an okay but bad overall, just better than a lot of other games. at that. A lot of lightweight tabletop RPGs. Again, it's not that I think they're bad. They suit my needs pretty well, but I feel that there's little advantage. They for people who don't need a rules framework, well, they already can ignore the rules. Having them there doesn't force them to follow them. And a playgroup with good communication would know that going into it. So I don't know. Again, the takeaway, I hope you will leave this parlay thinking, I just want people to have more fun playing these games. So when you apply these changes, just consider what problem they might solve. And if after a while things are not working well, it may make sense to pursue something else. Keeping in mind why you are playing, if it's D&D is good. And there's no right or wrong about why that is. But if you are playing D&D, for example, like for the math, or because it's the only game everyone knows, like that's not like bad or something. I'm not trying to say that the game objectively isn't for that, so that's bad. I actually would argue that, but that's not bad. Like, who cares, you know? But it would be useful to know that, because if you felt a bunch of friction with the game, it would then be worth asking, maybe we should play something else. Like maybe this isn't the right fit, or maybe we should fiddle with the rules in this certain way, right? So I don't know. I would hate for anyone to not have fun with games for longer than they need to because they did not do that. That's all I'm trying to say. Thank you for this really interesting parlay. Thank you for legitimately useful DMing suggestions. I'm really excited to try that squad leader thing. I feel like I didn't describe what I have in mind very well because I want to see what my players do with it. But I'm very interested in that. I would like to come back to that at some point. Thank you for asking.